a lot of times in Tokyo, you can be in a very, it doesn't look like there's any nature left. There's not a tree in sight. Mm-hmm. Everything is just concrete jungle. Mm-hmm. But you can turn a corner and there's an Inari shrine, or you turn a corner and there's an old garden from the Edo period that's been revived. And maybe, that gives you a sense of peace and sanctuary as well. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot more than meets the eye.
Hey, welcome to Japan Station. My name is Tony Vega. All right. If you've been listening for a while, you may remember that I mentioned I was going to Peru in February, and I did, and I came back, and I'm good. I'm okay. It was a great trip. Hadn't been in a while, and it was nice to visit. But before I went to Peru, I actually stopped by Miami, Florida. Now, I used to live in Miami, Florida for a very long time. Now I live in Hawaii. I came here for grad school, and I stuck around. Now I work here, but I used to live in Miami, Florida for a very long time, and I went to college over there at Florida International University. I majored in Asian Studies and Religious Studies, and while I was there, I took a couple classes with my guest today, Dr. Stephen Heine. Now, Dr. Stephen Heine is the director of the Asian Studies Department at Florida International University. He's also a very well-known and prolific writer, scholar, and expert on Zen Buddhism, specifically the Sōtō branch of Zen Buddhism. So I went to his office, took my recording equipment, and yes, we did talk a little bit about Zen Buddhism. That's not, of course, the focus of today's conversation. If you want to hear more about that, you can go to episode 6 with Geshe Claire Greenwood. But actually, we mainly focused on his recent book, which is called Sacred High City, Sacred Low City. Now, the city of Tokyo is very interesting in the way it's laid out. And even though it's not as old as a city like Kyoto, there's a whole lot of history there that, well, Dr. Heine really delves into in the book and in our conversation. So why is the city of Tokyo laid out the way it is? Why are these certain two neighborhoods that he takes a look at? One in the Shitamachi area, which is the lower area, and one in the Yamanote area, which is the higher hilly area. Again, he will explain all that much more in depth than I will right now. But why are these neighborhoods the way they are? And then he also examines how these neighborhoods are a reflection of the religiosity of Japanese people, right? So there's this kind of stereotype that Japanese people are totally divorced from religion, right? Religion is not a thing that they generally associate themselves with, but in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. And we discuss that, are Japanese people religious? Well, yeah, you're going to get to hear an interesting discussion about that and Dr. Heine's insights into the topic. So we also talk about a few other things, and there's a mention of Louis Black, the comedian, and just some other random stuff here and there. So it's a really, really interesting talk that I'm so happy I reached out to Dr. Heine, and he was so nice to just agree and give me more than an hour of his time, because we were talking before and we were talking after this, and it was probably an hour, 40 minutes or something that I was there in his office, a very nice office, by the way, it's a very new building that they put up in the campus. I hadn't been there before, so that was very nice. But anyway, I think you're going to enjoy this. And by the end of this talk, you're going to have a whole new insight into the city of Tokyo. And just like me, you're going to want to explore a lot of the areas that he mentions during the conversation. So anyway, here he is, Dr. Stephen Heine. Enjoy.
The next stop is Japan Station. The doors on the right side will open.
Like I was mentioning before, I did read through a bit through Sacred High City, Sacred Low City. And I've been to Tokyo many times, but I haven't spent long amounts of time there. Most of my time has been in Kansai, Osaka, Kyoto, Kobe,
right.
That area. So there's so much that I don't know about Tokyo. I know kind of the main spots that everybody knows. So it was really interesting learning about, Inarichō and all these places. But I guess we can kind of start with, what's the high city? What's this low city that you mentioned? Could you give a general idea of what that is, and then why you chose those?
Okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the history.
Mm-hmm.
So Tokyo officially was born in 1603. It was formed by the Tokugawa shogun and remained the central city in Japan until 1868. And then it became the capital of the Meiji era and the current era in Japan. And so I think what's interesting to me and many people about the structure of Tokyo is that the original design by the Tokugawa shogun from the early 1600s still is evident today in many ways. And in 2003, Tokyo celebrated the 400th anniversary of the start of the city. Before that, it was probably a series of villages, or it wasn't a major urban area. Quickly became one, and of course still is today. And so, in the structure of the city, the Tokugawa shogun was mainly concerned about his safety, security, protection from possible enemies and possible threats of assassination or some kind of rebellion. So he built the castle in the very center of the city, but surrounded it by moats and other barriers that would prevent people from who were uninvited from possibly invading and wreaking havoc in the castle. And then the castle was built surrounded by hills. So this is, the Tokyo is part of what they call the Kanto Plain. So there's not a lot of elevation in Tokyo. There is west of Tokyo in Mount Fuji, and the hills created a sense of the high city because it was higher up physically, geographically, and it created an impression of prestige, auspiciousness, good fortune. And so that's where the Tokugawa castle was, and that's where he placed the highest level samurai that were referred to as daimyo. Those were the warlords from the various provinces throughout the country. And they were required to visit periodically and stay in the city of Tokyo under the philosophy, keep your enemies closer, so to speak, so that a shogun could keep an eye on them. And then...
and that's the Yamanote area?
That's the Yamanote area. So Yamanote refers to being in the hills. And, what's interesting in today's world is that the Yamanote train line, which is, of all the subway and train lines that are available in Tokyo, which is several dozen of them, that's still the main line that makes a kind of circular path around the old Yamanote area. And a lot of the stops on the Yamanote line and other stops on subway lines in the area go by the names of the old parts of the city. So there were gates, there were lookout towers, there were bridges, moats, and you can still see those names in the train and subway stations today. That's one of the things that's interesting.
Yeah.
Another thing is that several neighborhoods were constructed that had an elevation, so that on a clear day you could see to Mount Fuji, and they're still called Fujimi Gaoka, or a hill where you can view Mount Fuji. And they because of pollution and because of other high-rise buildings, it's often blocked. The view of Mount Fuji can often be blocked, and of course the natural environment is often very foggy and hazy, so that would block it as well. But sometimes you still can see Mount Fuji in the area. One thing was that according to the old Chinese rules for geomancy, or for the placement of buildings that and the construction of cities that would be auspicious, the mountain is supposed to be behind the city, not to the west of it, but to the north of it. But they couldn't quite pull that off. So in some of the old maps, you see them describe Fuji as north, even though that's obviously
it's wishful thinking.
Yeah, they gave it a kind of spin.
Interesting.
And so the low city is also derived from some of the old principles of Chinese geomancy. So one thing is, if you the original great city of China, which was the capital for many centuries was called Chang'an. Today, Xi'an is close to where the old Chang'an was. And Chang'an was designed in certain ways according to the geomancy principles and also according to the idea of districting certain occupations and certain functions so they would be located in specialized parts of the city. It also was one of the first cities in the world history probably to have a grid plan. And all that was kind of duplicated in the way Kyoto was created in around 800. In Tokyo, they used some of the ideas, and they wanted to imitate some of what Kyoto had done in Chang'an and some new features of Kyoto, or some features of Kyoto that were specific to its environment. But the big change was that instead of having a grid plan where everything was clearly laid out and demarcated, they built it as kind of a labyrinthine swirl because they wanted to disguise the location of the castle and make it, as inconvenient as possible for people to access it unless they were specifically invited in. So there's no grid plan at all in Tokyo. Now, that's not true at very micro levels. So if you look at a subdivision of a neighborhood, it kind of follows a more orderly pattern. But the overall structure of the city is still very confusing, and any traveler to Tokyo, including Japanese who are new to visiting Tokyo, go through a certain kind of confusion to get oriented. Now, one of the features of the Chinese geomancy was that the northeast corridor of any location, whether it's a particular building or house, like a house, or whether it's a whole city, is considered the area that's susceptible to demons. It's known as Kimon, the demon's gate. And so you have to protect that area with certain kinds of materials. And basically, the main resource is to build a temple and or shrine complex in that area so that the gods of Buddhism and Shinto would protect the people located in the city from the invasion of demonic spirits. And that in Kyoto, the northeast corridor is where Mount Hiei is located, and so the city was built to allow Mount Hiei to play the protector role. And the Japanese Tendai Buddhist sect was established there in the early 800s after Saicho returned from China, and it still occupies the temples of Tendai School still pretty much occupy Mount Hiei, and that's the protector. So in Tokyo, you didn't have a big mountain. In fact, because they wanted to emphasize that since this was kind of a polluted area, since demons could occupy that area, they wanted to emphasize that it was below the Yamanote. It was Shitamachi, which is the town below. Or the low city. It was, it's not characterized by elevation, but physically, it's a low lying area, and in that area, the shogun wanted to put all the people and all the functions that were not considered to be prestigious that would stay in the high city. So in the high city, you had the daimyo, right? Living close to the castle, and then you had samurai of different ranks living a little peripheral to the daimyo surrounding the castle. But in the low city, in the northeast corridor, then you have the several functions that would not be allowed to occupy the high city. So. One has to do with death. So because of the old Shinto belief that got kind of appropriated by Buddhism and transformed by Buddhism in some ways, but the belief was still that the dead should not occupy areas connected with life force, so that the burial ground should be outside of the high city. So that meant that Buddhist temples, which did administer funerals and burials, were kind of stationed to a large extent in the low city, and there's still a large cemetery, huge cemetery, Yanaka Cemetery, that is located in the low city. Entertainment, so kabuki
Right.
And the theaters were the kabuki theaters were located there. And in the old days, kabuki was often accompanied by the geisha quarters, and that might involve prostitution, or it might be more artistic, but
Right.
Was less desirable to the high city. So that was located there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Like the old Fujiwara pleasure district.
the pleasure districts, yes, were located there. And interestingly enough, they would interact with the life at the temples a lot of times. There was an interesting book on the religion and society of that era called, I forget the exact title, but I think it was Prayer and Play, because one of the most famous temples in that area was known for its worship inside the temple, but right outside the temple grounds were all the entertainment and more playful activities.
Oh, okay.
Another activity that we talked about that's on the death side was the cremation grounds. Obviously, the Tokugawa shogun was known for having very severe approach to discipline and behavior by the general population, and people that were so they had a high level of imprisonment and cremation, and the cremation grounds were located in that area. So the Buddhist temples kind of thrived because the geisha often died very young. They were poor. They would get venereal disease. They were not taken care of. They would be under a contract system, and as soon as they got a little bit older, nobody cared about them. So there was a very high death rate apparently among the geisha, and then the Buddhist temples would administer the funeral rites to those kind of outcast citizens, and then the grounds for executing the prisoners that led to more opportunities for funeral. So I don't want to make it sound like they were taking advantage of that situation, but became these odd but very interesting, and you can still see them today. You can still see evidence of it in the way the city's structured today, of those associations between death and the geisha, between imprisonment and the Buddhist temples.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there was a need for it. So I guess you can't say it was taking advantage, so to speak.
Right.
Like,
yeah, there was a need.
Was a need anyway already there, right?
That's right. And also there was a major fire in 1657. So because the Buddhist temples tended to be wood buildings, of course wood was pretty common, but the temples were almost entirely wood, so they pretty much got wiped out. So the temples that existed in the Yamanote area, there were some, and some did remain. Some did get rebuilt there if they had a certain prestige, but most of them got moved out to either the northeastern corridor in the Shitamachi area, or further out west of Tokyo, which got built up in later years.
So within the Yamanote High City and then the Shitamachi Low City, like you focus specifically on Inarichō and Akasaka, right?
Right.
Like why those? And then could you explain, like, I know you make a point, like Akasaka is not Asakusa. I know, right? Many
right.
people kind of like, oh, I've been to Asakusa. It's like, no, Akasaka somewhere else.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, that was a common thing I would get from students coming back from study abroad.
Yeah.
And I would be talking a little bit my research on the Akasaka neighborhood, which is very much high city, and because it sounded a little bit like Sakusa, they would say, "Oh yeah, I was there." And you go, like, "No, you were in the low city." But the phonetic association does indicate that the high city and low city are not opposites, but have a lot of common factors, as well as opposing or conflicting issues. So I think one of the things I describe in the book, that for me it was kind of a personal journey. I went to Japan originally, and I still go to Japan mainly to study medieval Japanese Buddhism and the origins of Zen Buddhism, particularly Dogen, the founder of Sōtō Zen Buddhism, who lived in the 13th century. And I always tell my students, when I die, I'm going to be reborn in the 13th century Japan. I'm going to meet Dogen personally. And by the way, we are having a small conference on Dogen's life and thought coming up in March 29th. Yeah, with several scholars from from outside of FIU will join us.
Interesting.
And, so that's still my main reason to go. But one thing when you're studying these historical materials, you realize it becomes kind of overwhelming at a certain point. You can only study them through the lens of contemporary research. What's available today and how has it been collected and understood by the Japanese scholarship, first of all, is something that you use to try to recreate what was Dogen actually saying back then. And there's so many interpretations and so many theories and so many missing links because manuscripts got lost or got distorted or re-edited over the years. And then at the same time, modern researchers are discovering more and more materials. So you realize you're immersed in the modern situation to some extent. You can't avoid that. You can't really live in the 13th century.
Sure.
At the same time, Tokyo is such a fascinating place. Obviously, days when you're trying to get some relaxation, you're visiting many different areas in Tokyo. And the Tokyo history is shorter. A lot of people say, well, why don't you go to Kyoto if you're interested in Zen from the Middle Ages? Because most of the Zen temples from that era were in Kyoto, of course, and they still remain a great attraction. But that's the Rinzai Zen sect and the Pure Land sects. The Sōtō Zen sect kind of spread everywhere outside of Kyoto, and eventually became a very powerful force in Tokyo. So that's part of it. And because of that history, the major university for doing research on Dogen and the Sōtō Zen sect that he started is Komazawa University, which is near the Shibuya train station. And so that's why I've spent much more time in Tokyo. And Tokyo is so fascinating in its own way. And there are so many interesting temples there. So as I was traveling around casually, I would start to look and think to myself, someday I should write a book dealing with the contemporary religious situation in Tokyo. But I never really expected to be able to do that. I'd collect a lot of notes. And in the old days before digital, photography, I had all these hard copy pictures of shrines and temples, and I would start cataloging them, but I wasn't quite sure what angle to take or, if I would have enough material. So eventually I decided, okay, I have to focus on a couple of areas that really highlight the contrasts and the underlying similarities. So meantime, because of my interest in the medieval literature, the shape-shifting fox, kitsune, also referred to because it has a more benevolent side as a protector deity. Inari was associated originally with the rice cultivation, and then became associated with the merchant class in the Edo period, and it has to do with prosperity and good luck and good fortune and accumulating wealth. I had become interested in the origins of that because it goes back to medieval folklore. And it comes into Zen Buddhism in different ways.
Oh, really?
Yeah, from the medieval period. And as I was starting to get into that aspect, a Japanese friend of mine who was one of the professors at Komazawa University pointed out, well, you realize this Inari cult, a lot of people would call it, because it's not exactly Buddhist and it's not exactly Shinto, but it's very popular at and evident at Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines both. A lot of that had gotten integrated over the years into the Sōtō Zen Buddhist temples. And one of the major ones is in Tokyo, in the Akasaka neighborhood, is called Toyokawa Inari. Toyokawa is a town in Aichi Prefecture.
Oh, okay.
It's near the Shinkansen stop at Toyohashi. Okay. And it's a huge temple that's a Sōtō Zen temple, but they also have a central a hall where the Inari deity is enshrined, and they celebrate that just as much as they do Zen meditation.
Wow.
And in the Tokugawa period, a branch of that temple was established right in the heart of Tokyo, right in downtown Tokyo. So Akasaka, I refer to as kind of a high-rise blue suit neighborhood because there's a lot of corporations, a lot of big fancy hotels. The New Otani Hotel is near there. That was like the first major high-rise hotel built in the 1960s in Tokyo. And but right in the heart of that is this Toyokawa Inari Zen temple, but it looks more like a Shinto shrine, and people go there to make offerings on good luck days and festivals for travel safety and other auspicious events. And looks like a major Inari temple, but it is actually a Sōtō Zen temple. And it's administered, the rituals are administered by monks who practice meditation, but they don't offer meditation to the people coming to the temple. The temple offers prayer to Inari. So this,
interesting.
What the religious studies scholars would call syncretism or amalgamation or assimilation of different elements. My friend, Professor Yoshizu, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he pointed this out to me, that you should not just read the medieval literature, but you should examine, and this wasn't just a fluky example, there were many, many different cases of such kinds of syncretism. Tengu was also a common folk element that was absorbed into Sōtō Zen. And the major Tengu temple is in Odawara, which is outside of Tokyo, but it also plays a very similar kind of role.
Right. Those like bird kind of like goblin creatures,
That's right?
Right?
That occupy the mountains.
Yeah, and they like steal children.
Well,
right?
Both of them, both the Tengu and the Inari have a positive and negative side. So they bring this energy.
Yeah.
That can be demonic, but if they befriend you and protect you, then the energy is very positive. So the reason Tengu is celebrated at that mountain temple out in the mountains outside of Odawara, leading up to Hakone, is that the idea is that the Tengu looked after a Zen monk that was practicing meditation on a stone. They still have the stone where the Zen monk from the late 1400s was supposed to practice meditation for 20 years. Yeah.
And
that's a common theme.
Story.
Yeah, and it's a common theme at the Zen temples is that there's a meditation stone, a zazen stone is located there that they say goes back many centuries. It's hard, we never quite know if that historically that's accurate, but it's fascinating.
But it's a cool story.
It's a cool story.
Yeah.
So in Akasaka, unsurprisingly, you had this big Inari shrine that's actually a Buddhist temple. And, it's unsurprising because Inari is connected with fertility and prosperity and the merchant class that developed in the Edo period. And then I started to realize, well, wait a second, if you walk around that neighborhood, there's several other major Inari shrines or major shrines that have Inari as a major component. One is called Sanohia.
Okay.
Sanohia is located right next to the Kasumi Gaseki area where the Japanese government ministries are located. And Sanohia was a shrine that was supposed to have gone way back to like the 800s. We don't know for sure, but it predated the city of Tokyo by quite a few centuries. And it's located there and was rebuilt over the years to protect the Tokugawa shogunate and now to protect the modern government. How seriously people take this idea of protection in the modern world, that's a whole other issue that's fascinating, I think. But that shrine is located right in the heart of Akasaka. There's another shrine that, and they integrate Inari, and there's another shrine to General Nogi, the famous general in the war with Russia and the war with China, who committed suicide when the Meiji Emperor died. They were very close friends, and he committed suicide in a very fascinating, dramatic way.
I was just reading about that actually. He leaves like a note and everything.
He leaves a note. He wasn't at the funeral went right by his location when the funeral procession went from the palace, which replaced the castle, to a big cemetery. Aoyama Cemetery, which is right next to Akasaka, and General Nogi's house was in Akasaka, and when they got to the cemetery, he and his wife weren't there, and they were shocked, and then nobody knew that they had both committed suicide at that time.
Yeah.
They discovered the bodies later. So now that old home was preserved and made into a shrine.
Very interesting.
That has historical significance, but it also has Inari implicated in there as well. And in that shrine and some other major Inari shrines, they became famous for being wedding locations, right?
Okay.
So you still see some, very attractive old-fashioned style weddings where the bride is wearing a kimono, and there's a hotel right next door to the shrine, so that the family and guests can stay there, and so that's another very interesting feature. So, which you could refer to as a kind of life impulse in the high city, prosperity, weddings, birth. That's what the high city represents. More or less associated with Shinto rather than Buddhism, although it's very much integrated.
Sure.
Now let's go to Inarichō.
Okay.
You have the same word, Inari.
Yeah.
Inarichō is located very close to Ueno Park. So in the old days, Ueno Park wasn't as built up as it is today, and apparently a lot of foxes were living in that area. And I mean, one thing about the symbolism of the foxes in Japan and elsewhere is that foxes tend to live right on the edge of human habitation, and they like to come around human society, but usually they only appear like at dusk and twilight, and then they kind of scurry away.
Yeah.
So they became associated with rice because if you saw a lot of foxes near your rice field, it meant that the rice was really sweet and the foxes came to eat it. But you had to chase them away or else they'd ruin the crop.
Right.
And so, you always have this dual imagery that they're helping you and hurting you at the same time. So in Ueno Park, apparently in the old days, you would see a lot of foxes. So this one neighborhood became known as Inarichō or Inari Town. And then and it's hard to trace all of the history because, especially in the 20th century with the fire in the 1920s and then the bombing during the war in the 1940s, so much has been rebuilt. So things got moved around, and a lot of times they appear to be historical and they claim to be historical, but you're not quite sure. But at some point, the Inarichō district got developed as a major center for building storefronts that sold Buddhist altars, butsudan.
Right. You call it like the Akihabara of like
That's
butsudan,
right.
like the Buddhist altars, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's really interesting.
That's right. Because Tokyo. Remember when I first lived in Tokyo? This was back in the late 1970s, and you'd ask people, look, I want an electronic device. Go to Akihabara. I want to get a watch. Go to Shinjuku.
Yeah.
And, that districting effect is still kind of in place.
Sure.
I mean, it's diversified to some extent, but in Inarichō, you have literally 50 storefronts, and they're still there. Some of them are 3 or 4 stories, so they're kind of immense buildings selling not only the Buddhist altars, but other implements, rosary beads, incense, statues of Inari that people might want to have for a shrine in their backyard, or donate to a local shrine in their neighborhood. And so there's a very thriving industry still for the butsudan because of all the issues that are happening in Japan today, and with the declining population rate and the graying population. There's changes that are being researched on how the butsudan industry and the butsudan ritual practices are being revised somewhat, but it's still popular enough that you support 50 stores right in that one neighborhood, and then there are other stores that promise gendai butsudan or more contemporary butsudan that you can find in other neighborhoods as well. So that was one thing that really fascinated me. So Inarichō is located in a straight line, a street that goes from Ueno Park on the one side to Asakusa Temple, and that path goes for a couple miles, I guess, and that's where the stores are located. And then there's so many other fascinating things. You can go to the old execution grounds.
Really?
Yeah. And you can see remnants of the old temples that were there apparently in the Edo period. And they still have the same names, and it looks like this pretty much the same location. Some of them have been revived because people have gotten interested in this historical material. So they're not just decaying old temples; they've been rebuilt quite a bit recently. That's near the subway station called Minami Senju.
Oh, okay.
So you have a kind of very interesting triangle. A lot of it centering on death, where Minami Senju is a little bit north of the Inarichō Street, and then on one side you have Ueno, which was built originally to kind of duplicate Mount Hiei, and it has some of the same temples that follow the old rituals on Mount Hiei, and then you have Asakusa Temple that was built and became this in the Edo period and became the centerpiece for prayer and play that we talked about a few minutes ago. So all of those functions are going on in that Inarichō neighborhood. But on top of that, Inarichō, the way it turns out, is located near the neighborhood Sanya. One of my colleagues who teaches Japanese sociology at FIU does research on homelessness in Tokyo, Osaka, and also comparing it to LA and Miami. And he's having a big conference, actually, in a couple weeks here.
Interesting.
On
I had
topic.
no idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
He probably started teaching here just after you graduated.
Oh, cool.
So he's also interested in that neighborhood. And that neighborhood is what is known as Sanya. So for better or worse, Sanya became associated with the Bulakman community and with a lot of itinerant day laborers, people that would travel in from the northern provinces, and they take the train line that went, towards, maybe not as far as Sendai, but up into that area, and come down into Tokyo to get short-term jobs and to support their families back home, and a lot of times ran out of money or weren't able to return home and got kind of relocated or dislocated in that general Sanya district. And we, apparently some of that was evident in the Edo period, and it still continues today for various reasons. So that's, that's some unfortunate circumstances. My colleague Matt Marr is trying to show what is being done legally, and how the religions also have, especially Buddhism, has gotten a new interest in trying to have some social ethical commitment to try to deal with the people that are suffering economically and socially in that part of Tokyo. So, but it's not necessarily an unprosperous area either, because you can walk a few blocks away and you're in a more thriving neighborhood as well. So both neighborhoods are very complex and have a lot of contrasts and a lot of underlying interconnections.
Right. Perhaps we're going to veer off just a little bit, but what is that gendai butsudan, like the contemporary? What's different about a contemporary Buddhist altar versus like a traditional Buddhist altar that you would see in somebody's house, right? Because you see like the Kamidana Buddhist altar. The Kamidana is like the Shinto version, right? And then the butsudan is the Buddhist,
exactly,
like where you put the picture of your ancestor or something like that, right?
Yeah. So your ancestor, when we use the word ancestor, ancestor means a deceased relative.
Right.
And so that would be, hopefully people that are older than you that died a kind of natural death, your parents and grandparents. But, it could also be if a child dies from illness or an accident, or somebody younger could also be considered an ancestor. But they're kind of the direct predecessors of you that you still have a strong emotional connection. And going back to old time folklore beliefs in both China and Japan and elsewhere in East Asia, the belief is that the ancestors go into a kind of spirit world where they have certain ability to communicate with the living and to kind of look out for you. They're not really gods in a full-fledged sense of the term, but they're not just dead spirits as well, or dead entities as well, because they do have a spiritual value that can be very helpful. Again, it can also be hurtful if they become unhappy ghosts that kind of haunt the living.
Yeah.
So the aim of the butsudan and the kamidana are to help that communication process, to keep them very positive and not feel neglected. And so you install that in your house. Well, how old is that practice? Again, it's very hard to tell historically because a lot of these ideas get created in the early 20th century and people assume that they were around for hundreds of years. In some cases they were, in some cases not so much. So, but we do know that from the Meiji era that the butsudan practice had become very common, and it was pretty typical that almost all homes would have a butsudan or a kamidana or both in their home, and it might take up a whole special room of the house, because you wanted to show it a kind of respect and not interfere with that communication process. So it's an altar, and you would place incense and flowers and fruit and sacred objects in front of it to show your worshipful attitude towards the spiritual side that is kind of dwelling in that structure. So everybody needed one. They were designed a little bit differently based on which sect you belong to in Buddhism. So in Buddhism, there's like 6 or 8 major sects. And a lot of people had lost touch historically with what their lineage, what their family lineage was connected with, because there were so many changes in Japanese society in the 20th century. So a lot of times they had to kind of look it up in a register. And these big butsudan shops in Inarichō would cater, some of them would cater a special sect, and some of them that were, 4, 5, 6 stories high would have one story for each sect. So that, sometimes people would enter and not quite know, and then they would have a discussion with the salesman and say, "Oh, based on what you're saying, you must be this sect. So go to the 3rd floor."
Okay.
And they were made out of a certain kind of wood that was design and a certain kind of design. They could be very expensive. The whole funeral process could be expensive because, in addition to the butsudan, you also had to make donations to the temple for the funeral and some aspects of the ritual. And there was a saying that was used for a while: keeping up with the Tanakas. So if you saw your neighbors getting a very nice butsudan with like gold trimmings, with the very finest wood, then there was kind of social pressure on your family to do the same thing. You don't want to be upstaged. So, gendai butsudan. So, with all the changes that are happening, first of all, that wood isn't as accessible in Japan. So they had to get new kinds of wood in Indonesia or other countries. Also, like different styles of design were becoming popular in Japan, like Scandinavian furniture, which has a very, thin, narrow lines in the way the furniture is designed. People wanted it to have that kind of design rather than the old-fashioned Japanese design. That would be another change that would come into play. And also, as homes became more filled up with appliances, you didn't necessarily want to have a whole room just for this, because you might want to have that room for your washer and dryer instead. So they wanted it to look like a piece of furniture that would fit in with the decor. So it would kind of look like a TV. And fit in with the living room, so you can have it, but it didn't, dominate the whole house the way that it used to. So those are a few of the changes to make it more contemporary.
Interesting.
There was one story where a Japanese company was so successful in marketing the gendai butsudan that they opened a branch in Manhattan.
What?
They figured like if sushi is popular, but it quickly died out because, even Japanese Americans weren't necessarily going to do that.
Wow.
And that wasn't enough of a population to keep it going. But that was, in an odd way, that's a kind of indication of how popular it was in Japan.
Wow. Okay, so let's see. You draw a parallel between what you found in Akasaka and Inarichō and the way Japanese people view religion, right? It seems like what you get out of all that you did, your visits and your analysis, is a deeper insight into, how Japanese view religion, right? And the classic saying that you hear is people are born Shinto, die Buddhist, right?
Right.
But you add that they live Inari. Right.
Yeah.
So could you kind of explain a little bit about what is said about Japanese people, what their views on religion are, and then kind of what you were able to learn through your visits and your research? Good.
Thanks. I had two main conclusions. One, as you said, to insert the term live Inari in between born Shinto, die Buddhist, and the other is to change another phrase, which is that the Japanese are interested in practical worldly benefits from the religion, like doing well in business, passing an exam if they're students, having success, having prosperity. And I changed that to say that they're also interested in impractical worldly benefits, having to do with nostalgia, reminiscence, for the good old days, so to speak, and for communion, not only with the deceased spirits, but with the spiritual side of Japan, represented in art, aesthetics, nature, that are embodied in of course in Kyoto, but also in Tokyo in a lot of different ways. Okay, so the live Inari, so I think the major thing that you find, and you see this in technical quantitative surveys, and I also hear this anecdotally from a lot of my students returning from Japan, is that Japanese are kind of indifferent to religion.
Right.
Now, it kind of makes sense after so much turmoil in the 20th century that neither Shinto nor Buddhism have quite the luster that they might have had back in the pre-modern period. My feeling is that partly those surveys are misguided because when Japanese people are asked the question, do you care about religion, they associate the term religion and terms like God and terms like worship with Western Western views and Western institutions.
Like even the term shukyo, right? Like that's an introduced term, right?
Because a lot of words were introduced in the Meiji era to duplicate Western ideas and
views on religion, right? Like this is how religion should be, and
right. And so they're saying, no, we don't do that, But I think it doesn't mean that they're not interested in religion or they're not doing it. At the same time, there is a kind of cultural amnesia, so to speak, because, like I said, a lot of people don't know what sect their families were in, a couple hundred years ago, and they've lost touch with some of the traditions, but I don't think they've really lost interest. I remember the first time I lived in Japan, my wife and I lived on a kind of narrow shopping street in this district on the outskirts of Tokyo, and there was a shopkeeper across the street. Every day when he'd open the shop at 8:00, he'd throw water on the sidewalk, and he wasn't just trying to wash it down; he was trying to cleanse spiritually that space. Another shopkeeper would throw salt out there, like in the sumo tournament, and it was trying to purify the space. And there would be a matsuri going on once a month in the neighborhood. And my point is that there were many, many different aspects of religiosity. I use the term religiosity that weren't necessarily a specific institutional religion in an organized sense, but were evidence of a great attachment to religious traditions and rituals and trying to apply them into the modern world that was everywhere apparent. So if you read like Japanese don't care about religion, it's totally counterintuitive to how Japanese are acting. At the same time, in that place we lived, right behind us, there was a Shinto shrine and a Buddhist temple right next to each other, which is pretty typical holdover from the Edo period. And the Buddhist temple had the Mizokuyo ritual, that is a kind of confessional ritual for women that have had an abortion. And and at first I didn't recognize it because I was so immersed in the medieval world, like what was going on. But they had small Jizo statues that are there to honor the deceased fetuses. And certain times of the year, there'd be not so much of a celebratory ritual, but a remorseful ritual where the parents to be that never happened would visit the Jizo statues. And there were so many different examples of the religiosity happening. So I don't think Inari is by far, it's not the only example or necessarily the main example, but it is an example of something that, and we had tengu and there are dozens of other examples if you look at it in detail. But
Sure.
there is a attachment to traditional ritual life modified and applied into the modern world that occupies people, I think, almost every day and year round and supports the cycle. So between getting born and dying, that's 60, 70, 80 years of life. So religion just doesn't die out in between. So that's my idea of the live Inari.
Yeah, it's the way that, from my experiences and from even, my studies here in general, FIU and just, since leaving, it's a way of life, right? Like it's when this happens, you do this. When this happens, you do this. Right. It's not like this is religion. It's just this is how things are done.
That's right. This is how things are done. Yeah. There was a famous commentator on world religions named Joseph Campbell, who died a few years ago, and he had become very popular based on a documentary about his life and work in the 1980s. And he told a story that he went to a conference on world religions in Japan, and he asked the Shinto priest who was representing that tradition, what do you believe in? A kind of Western style question like that. And he said, "Oh, we don't believe in anything." He said, "Well, what's your religion about?" He said, "Well, we perform rituals." And I think Joseph Campbell still didn't quite understand that because he then referred to it as, it's a little bit complicated. So let me just backstep.
Sure.
The point was that, yes, it's a way of life. You do things at the appropriate time. Right. It's a custom. But it doesn't mean people don't think about it.
Sure.
And it doesn't mean they can't articulate a worldview based on it either if you give the benefit of the doubt, like, let's see what you're saying about it rather than fitting into our categories. So that's partly why I call it impractical worldly benefit. So some excellent scholars, including George Tanabe, who we talked about in a different context earlier, before this podcast, and then and Ian Reader, who was a professor in England, wrote a book called Practically Religious. Yeah, and what it was an incredible cataloging of different shrines and rituals throughout Japan that cater to certain functions that were trying to give a practical benefit. So people attended that shrine because they thought it was going to lead to a certain result that was a practical benefit. And then, but if you look at that phrase in English, when you say practically religious, it means like it's not really religious. It's just kind of imitating it.
It's almost religious.
Yes, it's almost religious. And they intended that, a pun. But for me, even though I admire those scholars and that's a great book that I borrowed a lot of ideas from, but for me, it was a little misleading because it's selling short that people are not getting some kind of spiritual benefit, So there's a term anshin, peace of mind, that I think is what applies in whether it's Shinto or Buddhist, whether it's Inari or Tengu or some other variation, whether it's for birth or death or in between, and for many other examples. So, like in that 400th anniversary of the city of Tokyo, they created a lot of historical walking paths. And sometimes, almost 20 years later now, you might not notice it. But if you're walking down a certain avenue, you might see that there's like a post that's been laid here. And when you look carefully, it says like, okay, in this neighborhood, there's 10 different historical sites that are of interest. Some of them might be, a famous samurai or a famous author who lived in that neighborhood in that Edo period, or they may be religious sites or other historical areas. And that in itself, I think, contributes to the sense of religiosity because you can commune with the past, you can identify with the cultural history, and it becomes part of a spiritual package, so to speak. That makes it sound like it's a commodification, but I think that there is a profound spirituality. We had a visitor to campus just last week who is a 11th generation craftsman in his family who does a certain kind of ceramics and also is a master in the Orasenki tea ceremony. And he was talking about the different aspects of spirituality that he's experienced in his own traditions and applied worldwide. He studied in America. He's been to Europe and other Asian countries. And he often does these creative things, whether it's designing a new kind of tea ceremony or developing a special kind of pottery to apply his artistic impulse. So I think the arts are something I've always felt are very much related to religiosity in Japan, especially if you go back to the poetry of the classical and medieval periods.
So 2 more questions, but one, just to kind of, I'm trying to connect it all together, kind of understand a bit better. So is it this need for practicality, so to speak, that shapes, ultimately influences Inarichō? It makes, it results in the butsudan stores, right? And then in the high city, in Akasaka area, it results in the kinds of things that you see there. So, for example, you see the weddings and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So is that how it kind of all ties in together?
Yes, but I'm adding the impracticality. So I think you said, I forget the word you used, but kind of an impulse or a need for the practicality.
Right.
But I think there's the same impulse for the impracticality. In other words, there's the visible and the invisible. So yes, on the outside, you're maybe purchasing a butsudan, whether it's traditional style or contemporary style. You're going to the wedding, and whether the bride is wearing a traditional kimono or a Western gown or both, maybe, and those are evident, and those are practical affairs, and they cost a certain amount of money that in the bubble economy was better suited in tougher economic times. It's harder to afford sometimes. But I again, behind that, those aren't empty mechanical rituals just for purely practical benefit. There has to be more to it, and that's what I want to bring out. There was a famous movie in the 1980s called Osōshiki, The Funeral, by a director who's died, but he made a number of popular movies in the 80s and 90s. Itami Juzo, I think his name was. He made the famous movie Tampopo about eating noodles, right? And he had The Funeral, which was kind of a scathing social satire of the idea that these two celebrity couple, and there's a death in the family, and then they have to watch a video to get instructions on what to do, and then they have to make a big donation to the Buddhist temple, and the priest comes in a limousine and very fancy robes, and kind of puts his hand out to collect their major donation. And,
wow.
I think there was a really incredible scene where one of them was committing adultery at the same time, and because they were trying to hide that, they stumbled, and the pile of money, of 10,000 yen notes, kind of flew up into the air, and the priest is running around trying to catch them. I can't remember. It was pretty amazing. So from that side. That satirical side, yes, it seems like it's practically religious, like the Japanese are kind of lost in the modern world. And I'm trying to look at things from all sides. I mean, one thing for me, Zen Buddhism teaches, look at every situation from every possible angle and don't be satisfied with one or other.
Sure.
But at the same time, we have to draw some conclusions.
Yeah.
And, one comment I got on my book was like, okay, well, you didn't tell us exactly what it meant in the end because I was trying to leave it open-ended. But but I think, both sides can apply. I mean, you can have the scathing satire and you could have something very serious and very moving happening in the same time, not only in Japan, but in all cultures.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there can be a sincere connection with the God that you are praying to in order to pass your high school entrance exam.
Right. Yes.
You're buying the omamori, the amulet.
Yes.
But you sincerely have that connection. You feel like there is something.
So if you
real
don't pass,
there.
you still have the connection?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. I should have prayed harder. I don't know.
Right.
So you mentioned a few for example, you mentioned Lewis Black, his routine on the Starbucks.
Oh yeah,
and so you find was it like a shrine in front of a shrine, something like that?
Yeah. Lewis Black one time some years ago said he found the end of the world in Houston, where he walks out of a Starbucks and he looks across the street and there's another Starbucks. Yeah. So that's how you start to feel with Inari to some extent.
Yeah.
And I bet it was very interesting. I think I have a picture in one of the pages of the book of what I call the littlest Inari shrine in the world, because you have these huge, magnificent Inari shrines, and you have smaller ones that are attached to maybe a bigger shrine or temple, and then people in their backyard might have one that just occupies a few feet, but and then there's all kinds of ones in between. I think one of the things about Inari is that if you look hard enough, you're going to see it a lot more evident than you might think at first. I was traveling a lot in Tokyo before GPS maps were available, so I'd have these hard copy, maps in these books that were published in Japan that had very detailed, kind of close up indicators of particular neighborhoods, and sometimes I would see there's if I walk down 2 blocks and turn the corner, there's another Inari shrine. So let me try that, if I'm not too exhausted that day. Yeah. And then I realized wait a second, there was one listed on the map, but there were 3 others maybe on the same street. Oh. Yeah. I mean, it was really amazing. So that's one of my ideas. Going back to the Miyazaki anime, Spirited Away, that a lot of times in Tokyo, you can be in a very, it doesn't look like there's any nature left. There's not a tree in sight. Everything is just concrete jungle. But you can turn a corner and there's an Inari shrine, or you turn a corner and there's an old garden from the Edo period that's been revived. And maybe, that gives you a sense of peace and sanctuary as well. So there's a lot more than meets the eye.
So last question that I had, but in a practical sense, let's bring it back to a practical sense. Somebody's going to Tokyo. I'm going to Tokyo this summer. Is there somewhere that you would recommend that is perhaps not so well known, but that you enjoy, that you think more people should know about, more people should take a look at?
Well, I think, what occurred to me, because my research has kind of navigated back to the medieval period.
Sure, yeah.
I don't know if I'll ever, have a chance to write another book on this kind of topic. But when I go to Tokyo, I realize that you could pick out almost any neighborhood. So let me recommend 2 places. One, because the last few years I've been occasionally giving some lectures at Waseda University, in the heart of Tokyo and located near the Yamanote train line. Boy, there's a brand new museum for Natsume Soseki in that area.
Really?
Because he had a house in that area. So that's one very, very interesting thing in that area. But, between Waseda and walking 10 minutes away to the to the Soseki Museum, you're going to find a dozen different kinds of temples and shrines that are very interesting to look at. So, in fact, right across from the campus, there's a large Shinto shrine that's very fascinating. So you can try something like that. Another neighborhood I would recommend is Koenji.
Okay.
It's a little west of Shinjuku, and it became known for retro clothing and jazz clubs.
Interesting. Okay.
So if I tell people in Japan, I'm going to do some research at Koenji, they go like, what, you got interested in jazz or something? I am interested in jazz, but I go, no, you don't realize it, but if you walk if you go north of the station, then you see all the clothing and jazz clubs. If you go south of the station about a mile, all of a sudden, there's about 15 Buddhist temples, all with their own style cemetery, all kind of assimilated with Shinto or some other tradition, and they're located in that area because I don't quite figure it out, but at some point there must have been a fire in a more central location, and then I think in the early 20th century the temples got relocated out here. But very, very interesting. You can spend an afternoon just wandering around those temples and looking at the variety of it. Many, many years ago when I was first going to Japan, I sat down in the train, and a Japanese struck up a conversation with me, and he said, "Oh, when you've seen one Buddhist temple, you've seen them all." But as we started talking, he really had a much more serious view, and then he said, "Oh, okay." Once he understood that I was serious about it, and then he gave me a lot of good advice that I still follow today.
Wow.
I still have the notes that I took from that conversation.
Wow.
So there's a lot of variety, even though on the surface they might seem similar. That's one thing you have to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Especially for you, you spend so much time in Japan.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've been around Kyoto, so many temples and shrines in Kyoto, but Tokyo, I haven't. And I think many people, they just have an image of the modern Tokyo, right?
The modern Tokyo. Right. So you think, okay, people know about Asakusa on the northeast side, and then they know about Meiji Jingu on the southwest side.
Yeah, those are the big ones.
And they don't think about too much else. But when you stop and point it out, so I did have, actually somebody I became friends with was an American scholar who was teaching world religions, but not necessarily Japan. She didn't know much about Japan, but she ended up in Japan for a conference near Ueno, and she said, well, I got to find out something about what's happening in religion in Japan. And so she contacted me because she said somebody recommended my book, and she was near the Inarichō neighborhood. So I have a couple maps showing different locations in that chapter of the book. And she said she followed it one by one. Her daughter was with her, and they went one by one. And she said, oh my God, it completely changed their trip. I haven't gotten, that much feedback, because it's still a scholarly book, but that made me feel good, because it kind of points out that if you really take a close look, but you can do that, in so many different parts of Tokyo. It's not just restricted to a couple of areas. That's one of the interesting things. So someday I want to do more. For example, I'll end with one last example. Is the Shichifukujin, the 7 Gods of Happiness. In fact, I have a book, I think I have it at home now, a Japanese book, and they have a tour map of 60. So Shichifukujin means that usually there's 7 shrines or temples located in a particular neighborhood. Each one is dedicated to one of the 7. And you can take a little tour. You can do one a day, one a week, depending on, how much time you want to put into it. Or you can do them all in one day if you have enough time. And there's 60 main areas. And when they say 60, there's probably many more than that. But they have 60 in this book, and they give you a little map.
So 60 groups of 7.
60 groups of 7, and they give you a little map for each one, and they tell you exactly it's going to take you 4 minutes to walk to this one, then 14 minutes to walk to the next one. So usually they're about an hour if you want to do them all in one area. And then of course it's Japan, so book also tells you where the good noodle shops in the in the neighborhood, and other places to stop in the neighborhood. Besides,
and that's an English language book?
No.
Oh, it's in Japanese?
Okay. No, this is I also noticed that for particular, because when I was interested in Akasaka, that's in I guess it's in Chiyoda. It's in Minato-ku, I guess. But each a lot of these wards would have, if you go to a Japanese bookstore, there might be a tour guide for that particular ward. So it gives you a much more close-up of spots in that area that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Yeah, so there's quite almost endless variety, I would say.
Yeah, that's all. Like I said, I don't know Tokyo that much, but I'm very curious in visiting some of the places that you mentioned. Inarichō, like I'd love to go check that out, and like the old execution grounds, like Minami Senju, you said, right? Yeah. So that sounds very interesting to me, and something a little bit.
So you go for the
different.
death side.
Well, even like up in Akasaka, was it the General Nogi?
General Nogi.
Yeah. That sounds.
No,
very
that's it. So
too.
there's some death in the life side, and there's some life in the death side.
Right.
Because one of the, there's that Kotsu Anzen,
traffic safety, right?
Traffic or travel safety.
Oh, okay.
So one of the big shrines for that is located right in between Inarichō and the Sanya district, which is an unprosperous district, but in between there's a kind of prosperous temple, and people. One time I went there on a Sunday afternoon, and I noticed this group of people came up. They were very, very well dressed, and they were very well off business people, but they were going on some international travel the next day, and so they decided that we better make a stop at this shrine.
Hey, well.
Yeah. So was it for practical or impractical reasons? That part, I'm not sure.
Guess it depends on each person a lot of times too, huh? Yeah.
Well, it's great to have a chance to talk to you.
Absolutely. And, thank you so much. Fascinating stuff, and wonderful to get to see you again and talk again. Thank you.
All right.
Hope you enjoyed that. I know it was a long conversation, but there was just so much. I mean, this was like the dark matter of podcasts. It's massive, just brimming with so much information, just fascinating stuff. So I am so honored and happy that I got to talk to Dr. Heine in this way after so many years. I hadn't seen him since, I think he mentioned it in the podcast, but since like 2010. Anyway, so really, really interesting stuff. And I'm planning to be in Tokyo in June. So hopefully I'll get to visit maybe Inarichō or something else there that we discussed. I'm still working out my plans. But yeah, fascinating stuff. And by the way, I will post a video of that Lewis Black routine about the end of the universe with the Starbucks and all that we mentioned. And I'll see about, there's a link to his book too in the show notes, so you can get that at japanstationpodcast.com. Now, please, if you haven't done so yet, leave a review for the show. If you're enjoying the show, if you like this episode or any of the other ones and you're coming back, then please subscribe and leave a review. So we're on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, whatever it's called, the Google Play podcast store, and of course Stitcher and TuneIn, and a few other places here and there, but those are, all the main ones. Those reviews really, really help get the word out. Recently, I was at KawaiiCon, which is the largest anime convention here in Hawaii, and I was there just because of my job. I was there all 3 days. I work for a magazine called Wasabi, Wasabi Magazine. You can find out more about that at readwasabi.com or at readwasabi on Facebook and Instagram. I'm the editor-in-chief, and we focus on Japan and Japan-related topics in Hawaii. So anyway, we were there. We had a booth, and we did a workshop with a manga artist from Japan, Kazuo Maekawa. He did the manga adaptation of Ace Attorney. If you're familiar with like Phoenix Wright and Miles Edgeworth, he did the manga for those. Anyway, so we did a workshop and booths, and I had this hat on with Japan Station the whole time. And so when I went to check my downloads at the end of the weekend, I saw just like a huge spike over the past 3 days. So I'm assuming that maybe some people saw my hat and started downloading the podcast, which if that's the case, that's awesome. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you guys checking out the podcast. Hopefully you're still here. You didn't bail after one episode. But if you're enjoying it, if you're a new listener, old listener, please leave a review, subscribe, rate. That really, really helps the show keep on growing. All right. Anyway, so thank you so much to Udemy for allowing me to use Oedo Controller as the opening and closing song. And of course, if you'd like to keep up with all the updates on japankyo.com and anything Japan Station related, you can do so by following at Japankyo on Facebook and at Japankyo News on Twitter. All right, so that's it for this extra jam-packed episode of Japan Station. Make sure to come back on May 1st because it's going to be a fun one. Actually, I just recorded an episode today with Kevin Derendorf. Now, he wrote a book called Kaiju for Hipsters. And we had a really fun conversation all about, crazy kaiju movies. Okay, we went like really, really deep here. That whole book is all about kaiju movies that aren't the typical ones you think of. So of course, Godzilla and all the kind of mainstream, Mothra and all that kind of stuff. He went like 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 layers deeper. So make sure to come back on May 1st for that. It's going to be a good one. There you go. That does it. Episode 11. We're out. Go find your miniature pony.
Just do it!